Hello, everyone. Welcome back. My name is Amalia Leguizamón. I'm an associate professor in sociology at Tulane University. Uh, so if you can recall our last meeting, we explored the socio-environmental history of bananas in Central America from the sociological perspective of the political economy of the environment. And what we did is we used this framework to look into the actors and institutions that control resources, the flows of material that sustain life, and the consequences of those decisions. We asked, who has power to decide? And we saw that the fruit companies, the private corporations, were given land and transportation concessions by the government to expand banana farms and monopolize the export business. We looked into the social and ecological consequences of banana production for exportation, from the devastation of local ecosystems to turn jungle and swamps into banana monocultures, to the pollution and harm to workers' health as a consequence of chemical fumigations to stop Panama and Sigatoka disease. From a sociological perspective of the political economy of the environment, we are interested in understanding how uneven power relations exacerbate social and environmental injustice. So we ask, who reaps the benefits and who bears the cost? And how have different social actors organized to regain or gain decision-making power? So in particular, our topic for today is on the socio-environmental movements. People from civil society organizing against environmental injustice. So in our last meeting, we explored how fruit companies and local governments pursue profitability, economic growth, progress, and development through banana exports. This model this model of socioeconomic development based on the large-scale extraction of natural resources for exportation, we call extractivism. In Central America, in Latin America in general, extractivism dates back to the Spanish conquest, from silver and gold through bananas, coffee, sugar. Now, since the early 2000s, there's been we are in a new extractivist boom, mostly due to an increase in commodity prices and rising demand, mostly from China. This has triggered new waves of extractive investments in agricultural crops like coffee, bananas, sugar, and palm oil, to cattle ranching in places like Guatemala, Honduras, and Costa Rica. We also see more and more mining projects for gold in El Salvador, Guatemala, Honduras, Nicaragua, and for copper in Panama. And we're also seeing some hydrocarbon projects to extract oil in the Guatemalan Petén forest. Now, these extractive investments require massive infrastructure projects or mega development projects to sustain the extractive activities. And this takes the form of roads and railroads, the deployment of new technologies like open pit mining or hydraulic fracturing, or the damming of rivers to supply energy. As with the case of bananas, these extractive activities take a heavy toll in society and the environment. So today we're going to explore the socio-environmental movements that have emerged to resist extractivism and mega projects in Central America. In particular, we're going to learn about Berta Cáceres, an Honduran activist who was killed in 2016 and leader of the Lenca people, who organized a grassroots campaign against the building of a hydro dam in the Rio Blanco. Now, the struggles for environmental justice are not unique to Honduras, but actually sparse throughout, the world. This is only a detail of Central America. This is the Environmental Justice Atlas that you can find online. This was started with, it was started by the scholars at the Universidad Autónoma de Barcelona. So these are people from all over the world trying to map these struggles for environmental justice. And the different dots mean different kinds, right? Like, and you can see here on the top the legends, right? Like these are grassroots organizations protesting against nuclear sites, which we don't have in Central America. But mineral extraction, waste management, land conflicts, fossil fuels, water management, tourism, etc., etc. It's a fascinating tool that I invite you to explore. And again, it shows how people across the region are organizing to defend life and livelihood against land and water dispossessions. Now, I'm particular about these environmental justice movements that are organizing to defend nature, but also life and livelihood from extractive activities, right? And the interesting thing about environmentalism in the South, in Central America and Latin America, and the Global South in general, is that it distinguishes from the environmentalism of the North, right? The goal is not to conserve and protect these pristine environments, right? That the idea is less to create national parks, for example, which is the origin of the environmentalist movement here in the United States, right? But it's mostly grassroots, bottom-up, organized by mostly indigenous peoples, and it's been mostly women-led, which is an interesting aspect, right? But these are mostly people in the territories, right? Like these are people that are being affected and impacted by the extractive industries because they come into their lands and they aim to dispossess them from their territories and from the places that they call home. So this activism um, um, has multiple purposes, right? As I said, most of all are in relationship to gaining control, regaining decision-making power, right? But it's not just about distribution in the sense of being included and participating in this in the benefits of extractivism, right? Like going back to this question of who reaps the benefits and who bears the cost, right? What we see is that the people who live near or on extractive sites, right, are bearing most of the cost on their bodies, and they're reaping less of the profit. So what these movements are demanding is to participate in gaining this benefit, but mostly in regaining decision-making power over these natural resources, right? Because mostly the people who live by these sites have the least to say into what happens on their lands, right? So it's about distribution, but it's also about recognition and participation, right? Of fully participating, of being included, of being considered citizens in this uh, in this in the creation of in decisions over what to do over these territories. And what is interesting too is that it's also demanding the right to impose particular languages of valuations, right? Like even thinking as we explored in our last class about bananas, right? Like the conquering of nature is equated to progress, is equated to modernity, right? Like development equals economic growth equals taming and dominating nature, right? Like, but who says, right? Like who has power to even decide what we value? Do we value profitability and economic growth more than, for example, this is what indigenous movements are saying, nature in and of itself, right? Or sacred valuations of nature, or nature says more than human beings. So how do we put a value to nature that is not just as a resource that has a price? So these are important questions that these movements are bringing to the forefront. So again, the idea is that these movements are proposing to defend nature, not just out of a tree-hugging need, right? But also because these are the places where they live, where they make a livelihood. In addition, again, to their sacred tradition. Now, of course, as you can imagine, this is quite a deadly business. More and more extractive activities are being forced into these communities, and whoever dares to organize is facing death. And this is a map. This is a graph that I took from Global Witness. Every year they run a report over what is the status of these crimes against land and environmental defenders. Only in 2019, so this is a report from this year, comes a year late, right? 212 activists around the world were killed, and of course this adds for over 200 every year, right? And we see that Honduras, Guatemala, and Nicaragua are amongst the most dangerous country. Now Colombia is topping the charts, and Brazil. These are people trying to protect the forest, mostly from gold, oil, palm oil business. So as I said earlier, what I want to tell you today is about the Lenca people in Honduras and how they organized against the building of the hydro dam called Aguasarca. And here it is in the map that I showed you earlier, the environmental justice atlas. So Berta Cáceres. Berta Cáceres was a descendant or part of the Lenca people, which are the largest indigenous group in Honduras. Since she was young, she has been involved in indigenous activism, defending or fighting against racism, machism, and the general segregation, exclusion, and abandonment that indigenous people continue to be victims of. As an indigenous activist, one of her main goals was to defend territory against the dispossession of land, right, by different governments and private companies, and demanding the state to guarantee fundamental rights as indigenous people. In 1983, she was one of the main founders, and then she became, of course, a leader of COPIN, the Council of Popular Indigenous Organizations of Honduras. Some people translate it as Civic Council of Popular Indigenous Organizations. So this is what is going to become like the national network of different indigenous groups across the country. The idea was to bring people together in the collective struggle for political, social, economic, and cultural rights, right? But again, particularly her struggle was around the Lenca community. With time, COPIN grew in strength and numbers, right? They successfully pressured the government to build roads, schools, health centers, and different projects, right, to bring drinking water and electricity to indigenous communities. And they started taking on private industries and began confronting this mega project. Most significantly, COPIN was extremely successful in pushing or demanding the Honduran state to sign into the Convention 169 of the International Labour Organization. And this is happening all across the Latin American region, which is something that becomes a very, very powerful legal and political tool for indigenous communities for demanding decision-making rights, right? So what the ILO 169 does is that it recognizes the rights of indigenous communities over the land and natural resources. And it forces the government to first consult with people, with the people that live on the territory regarding any plan, law, or project that affects them. So it requires the company, the private company or the government who's going to set up their mega project to give an environmental report in advance to the community that then the community needs to consent on. This is why it's called prior informed consent, right? Like the community needs to be informed and needs to give prior consent before the building of any mega project. So as I said, it becomes a very, very important tool because now the private companies cannot just enter and build, right? But they have to find ways to negotiate. And this becomes also complicated in ways that I'd be happy to talk to when we meet in person. So in particular, the Aguasarca hydroelectric plant was filled with some government funding in what became the Desarrollos Energéticos, DESA, and had funding from Dutch, Finnish, and Chinese development banks. And the idea, the plan was to build this hydro dam to bring energy, and the dam would cross or stop the Hualcarque River, which is a sacred river for the Lenca people, spiritually, but also in practice, right? The river is used, as I said earlier, for life and livelihood, fishing, water, crops. So that was going to dramatically change, alter, and harm life or community, environment and community. For her work, Berta Cáceres was awarded the 2015 Goldman Environmental Prize, and I invite you to look at her acceptance speech because it's very powerful and very moving. The Goldman Environmental Prize, some people call it like the Nobel Prize of Environmental Activism. The most, or one of the most important things about the Goldman Prize is that it helps grassroots communities, so people that were working on the ground to become now known by the world, right? Like so suddenly Berta Cáceres, she was already a fly in for the government and the development banks and the companies that were trying to put this in practice, right? But suddenly, like the problem, she as the problem became huge because now she attracted all this international attention, and for that and many other reasons, for these reasons, she was murdered in March 2016. The 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 details of her killing are told in this story, Berta y el Río in Radio Ambulante, in this podcast, which is absolutely fascinating, and I invite you to hear it. The trial is still in the making, and this is 5 years after, right? So the legal culprits, who their family and indigenous people think is not just the persons who killed her, right, but the government, the corporations, etc. But that's still ongoing. And of course, she's not the first, not the last one to die defending land and livelihood from dispossession in Central America. So I totally went over time. So if you have any comments or questions, please shoot me an email. And I'm very much looking forward to meeting you in person in June. Thank you.